It is the early 1970s, and a writer is holed up in Palm Springs at one of the most unusual restaurants in operation. The restaurant has a sole proprietor. The menu has one dish. There's no advertising or tourists because there are only 4 tables. The topic of conversation is whether to turn a stage play into a musical, and the person who's both the server, the cook, the owner, and the sole employee is also a psychic. When asked about the play, she says, quote, "It will be extremely successful. In fact, it will overwhelm your life," end quote. 2 years later, in 1972, the production would open. The playwright was Dale Wasserman, and the project was converting Don Quixote into the Man from La Mancha and making it into a musical. It would go on to play over 2,000 shows and get translated into at least 30 different languages, according to Wasserman, quote, "Figures affirm that it may be the most popular play of the century. It may be eligible to become the most popular musical of all time," end quote. Something mystical was in play. Wasserman would also write this quote, "Facts cannot explain the success of the Man from La Mancha. Something more was at work." I'm John Bruschke, and you are listening to Theater, History, and Mysteries, where I take a musical theater production and do a deep dive on the questions that it raises and the answers that it provides. I hope that this approach will give a deeper understanding about the lessons that the musical has for theater and for life, and I'll never miss any opportunity to pursue a mystery, bizarre coincidence, improbable event, or supernatural suggestion along the way because, in the words of Dirk Gently, it is all connected. This is the third installment of the first musical that we're going to take a look at. In episode 1, we talked about the book, which is the second greatest story ever told, or at least the second most popular story in terms of total sales and the number of people who've read the book. It was the greatest story that was not the direct word of God. It was a big freaking deal. It created a new form of literature. It was first published in 1605, and it's never gone out of print. In episode 2, we learned about Cervantes, the human being, the person, the author. We learned that he was brave, loyal, honest, optimistic, and maybe, to borrow a phrase from Shakespeare, star-crossed. He'd repeatedly gone bankrupt. He was repeatedly imprisoned for things that he didn't do, or just for being a good soldier or doing his job well. He really wanted to be a playwright and not a novelist, and he could never give up on that calling. His book came out in 1605 when he was 58 years old. And here's a new fact. Not only did it come out in 1605, but between 1596 and 1602, the plague had arrived in Santander by ship from Northern Europe, likely from the Netherlands, and Madrid in 1599 and Seville in 1600 were especially hard hit. The epidemic is estimated to have killed around 500,000 people in Castile. From 1599 to 1600, Don Quixote was conceived on the ruins of the plague. And that was the time in which Cervantes, the star-crossed tax collector, soldier, and would-be playwright, was writing Don Quixote. And from this pile of tragedies emerged a truly remarkable comedy. So we're finally at the musical theater part of this journey. How did that novel get turned into a musical? Some quick bookkeeping first. I did a soft launch of this podcast in August just to see if I could get the website and the recording gear set up and see how you went about putting an audio file online and editing it a little bit. The episodes had some truly unfortunate audio quality, and my friend and colleague Chris Losnegard did some heroic work trying to salvage what sounded to most of you like a screeching owl with a lisp making a recording in a steam tunnel. If you are one of the 30 hardy souls who survived listening to those caterwauls, I am forever in your debt. Eventually, I just decided to re-record all the episodes, to re-upload them, and we now have at least passable recordings of the first 3 episodes, of which this is one. After we wrap up Don Quixote in this episode, we'll take up the Phantom of the Opera and release an episode every 2 weeks. If you haven't heard the first 2 episodes yet, I hope you'll go back and listen to those. There are parts of Cervantes' life that are truly amazing, and if you don't really know what a big deal the book is, it's worth reviewing that material. And now is the time. I must make the inevitable call for your support. If you like this episode, please subscribe. And if you have musical theater friends or friends who like history and especially strange historical coincidences, I will be deeply, deeply grateful if you share the show link with them. The podcast is in its 3rd episode, and I'd really, really like to get this some traction. I hope you enjoy it. On to episode 3, where this knight errant will be waving my sword at and presenting my shoddy research about the Man from La Mancha. For this task, I will be leaning very heavily, if not exclusively, on Dale Wasserman's own book about the production, which he titled The Impossible Musical. Wasserman himself had, by his own account, about a year of high school education. He bounced around for a lot of odd jobs, spent some time jumping trains, but was in theater since about the age of 19. Now, the reason I mentioned that he had about a year of high school education is that is eerily similar to the amount of education that Cervantes had. Definitely. Neither of them had what you would call a diploma, even like a Trump University diploma. Neither of them had ever done a university level study of literature. And yet Cervantes, the creator of the original narrative, would write the first and maybe the greatest novel of all time. And Wasserman, without more than a year of high school, would write one of the most successful musicals of all time. Genius survives all assessment testing. And if you have a friend who didn't graduate from high school, definitely send them the link to this episode. Wasserman's account is that he was in Spain and working on something when all of a sudden the statue of Cervantes caught his eye. And from that moment on, he did everything he could to learn about Cervantes the man and how the narrative Don Quixote came about. And that's probably not untrue, but his lack of education definitely was a hindrance to his ability to understand the novel and convert it into his fantastic musical. Some things are minor, like the number of escape attempts Cervantes had when he was a prisoner, but others are bigger, like his involvement with the Inquisition. And that brings up the topic of just what my research is all about, or what research is all about. I mentioned this a little bit in episode 2, and I'm just going to pause here and take my first side quest to set up what it means to know something about a subject. Primary research is when there's a question out there and you want to know the answer to it. You get your professional credentials, and then you read all the other peer-reviewed published research on the subject. Then you collect your own data. That's primary research. Secondary research is that you read all that stuff that other people have done and come to your own conclusions about it. If you were in college and you read a textbook, you were relying on a professor to go out there and read all the original research and then summarize it for you in 20 to 25 pages. Very good, but that is secondary research. And then there's everything after that, including what I'm doing for this podcast is selective. You pick the stuff that's interesting or because you want to pursue it, but not because you're trying to be exhaustive. You are not trying to read everything that's out there, and you're not trying to do original research. You're getting pieces of the puzzle, but not all of it. And if the extent of this third-hand research is Googling or Wikipedia, then you're just sort of at the whims of the worst of the internet and what other people go through out there. So I implore you, take all the research you get from the internet with a huge grain of salt and try to figure out what's true and false before you get into a big throwdown argument on the subject with your relatives at Thanksgiving. Anyway, there is good original research to be had. Please look it up. And that's what I'm trying to do for you in this podcast. Which gets us back to the question I want to pursue. Cervantes was definitely in prison, and he definitely tried to escape. And according to Wasserman, there were 7 attempts, although he does not cite a single source that says that. I think someone with a college degree probably would. Malvina McKendrick, an author at one of the Cambridge universities, lists and discusses in great detail 4 escape attempts. McKendrick's account sounds a little more convincing than Wasserman's. Wasserman also claims that Cervantes wrote 40 plays and that only 2 survive. McKendrick says that 2 were from an early period, but 9 were from the years 1580 through 1605. There was a book that Cervantes himself published in 1615, right before he published the second part of Don Quixote, and that was entitled 8 Interludes and 8 Plays, and those still survive. So you can get a copy of it off of Amazon.com today if you wanted to, which makes it seem like at least 8 of the plays survive, not the 2 that Wasserman claimed. And as a side note, Scott Miller, who's the artistic director of the New Line Theater in St. Louis and loves writing about the Man from La Mancha, and especially likes writing about the connection between the story and the Inquisition, which we'll talk about later, says that no plays survive. Now, I'm not sure what period he's referring to, but since there's a book with 8 of them in it, I think that number is in fact greater than 0. He also thinks that Cervantes was excommunicated because Cervantes was Jewish, and he also thinks there's no record of how he inexplicably escaped the punishments. He speculates that it must have been because Cervantes was a brilliant master of language. He was able to talk himself out of all of it. We will discover in the next 30 minutes that not all of that is true. And according to McKendrick, it was clear that he was imprisoned due to his service as a tax collector, and that he was also excommunicated just because his job was to commandeer for the military the stuff that they needed, and he collected that stuff from the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church did not want to give it up, so they excommunicated Cervantes. All of that happened, so he was excommunicated, but it was not because he was Jewish. Although I will say it did suck to be Jewish in Spain in 1600, and especially during the plague. In those distant medieval times, bad rulers would try to cover their own incompetence by blaming any disaster on a minority group that they thought they could scapegoat. Thank God we live in an enlightened era where nobody would do something as mean-spirited as accusing Haitian immigrants of eating house pets or something. I'm glad that is all in our past. Anyway, it was happening to the Jews in Spain in 1600, but that did not affect Cervantes, as he might have had some distant Jewish connection, but that did not seem to be the center of any of his troubles. Anyway, it's very clear how he escaped punishment. In Algiers, he was a ransom prisoner, and he wasn't getting brutalized or killed because if they killed or maimed him, they were not going to get the ransom, the money that others would pay to have him released. And he wasn't punished in Spain because the charges were bogus, and he appealed both times, and he was restored both times. Anyway, even shoddy research can reveal some truths that are usually more interesting than made-up tales. So the take-home point is, yay, research. So Wasserman got a few things wrong and is not necessarily the guy that I would trust with a Cervantes historiography, but I do think we can trust him talking about himself. The book that he wrote was published in 2003. It's called The Impossible Musical, The Man of La Mancha Story. And I think that since he has a firsthand account of how the script would become a musical, I think we can trust him to talk about that. But there is an interesting footnote which does say much about the research. Again, if you go to Wikipedia, you can look up Wasserman and the Man from La Mancha. And it says in there that one of his most famous lines, including the phrase, "to dream the impossible dream," actually came from promotional material written for a version of Don Quixote that was made into a play that appeared in 1908. So the allegation against Wasserman is that that line was not his. And if you believe Wikipedia and the internet, you might just say that Wasserman plagiarized one of his best lines to make it into a musical, and that would be a reason for us not to trust Wasserman and his account. But again, this is Wikipedia, so if you go to the very bottom of those Wikipedia pages, whoever put that comment in there included a reference. There is one for that plagiarism accusation, but I can't actually find any reference to it, and the reference itself is in Spanish. So I'm not going to run all the way down this rabbit hole other than to say that it's a small demonstration about how various claims can fall apart when you do minimal research to see what evidence you have supporting it. Some of the stuff that is out there written about Don Quixote or the Man from La Mancha is actually not true. Research can track that down. Some of the allegations against Wasserman are also not true, or at least when you say, what is the source to support that? And you look into it, it very quickly falls apart. Back to our main storyline about how Don Quixote went from being a novel written by Miguel de Cervantes to a musical written by Dale Wasserman. As a quick biography on Dale Wasserman, he also wrote, interestingly, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which was adapted from a book, although he had no part of the movie adaptation. The lead character in that was also somebody who is insane, or at least considered by those around him to be insane. So his two biggest successes seem to center around lead characters that had serious mental problems. Dale Wasserman was a theater guy. He had a reputation as a grumpy old man. He described himself as reclusive and antisocial, but he was doing a bunch of stuff in theater at a time when television was gaining traction. So he's got a job doing stuff on TV and in theater in the late 1950s. Eventually finds his calling as a writer, which sets up how The Man from La Mancha got its very first production. Wasserman is now writing various things, and the very first production he writes of The Man from La Mancha is produced for television. Now, the play was written in the 1950s, and it got sold very quickly to television. It actually surprised Wasserman how quickly somebody bought it. He writes the script, he sends it to his agent, he gets the news, hey, it's been bought out, it's going to be produced, and it's going to air on television in November of 1959. That's kind of an important year because in 1960, that was the year of the Nixon-Kennedy debate. That was the first televised presidential debate. And the reason it got televised was because TV had emerged as enough of a media that it was the first time that the whole country could, at the very same time, hear a presidential debate and watch the candidates in real time as it was happening. And that is marked in media studies as a time where television started to take over American culture. And so The Man from La Mancha is getting its very first produced performance the year before that debate, right as television is really becoming a big thing. TV at the time did have some scripted shows and running serials, but it was still new enough that there was plenty of room for innovative content, and it was not yet firmly established what would and would not work on television. It was going to be a big deal for sure, but no one had yet cracked that formula for what the medium was going to be. So in 1959, what worked on television was still not entirely known by anyone, including the TV producers. What is it we're going to put on TV? There are ideas, but there's no formula. And one possibility is that you can show live theater on TV. And one production that does that is the DuPont of the Month show. So they pick up the script. Yes, that is DuPont, the large chemical company. It was not uncommon for a company to sponsor an entertainment event, that massive radio event, The War of the Worlds, the Orson Welles production that presented itself as a live news broadcast of a Martian invasion that was supposed to have produced mass panic, was part of the Campbell Playhouse. That was sponsored by Campbell's Soup. They did a bunch of other famous books adapted into radio plays, including Dracula. And I find it amusing that some of these really seminal media events happen under the direct names of corporate sponsors. Who was the underwriter for the mass panic that the War of the Worlds was supposed to have caused? Campbell's Soup. It is in a similar series that Don Quixote will first appear. They're going to do a production of Don Quixote that's going to appear on television under the DuPont show of the month. Here are some of the key things that happened in that television production. The lead actress quit only 3 days out, but was replaced by Colleen Dewhurst, who would, of course, go on to have a hugely successful career. In the script, Don Quixote rode a horse, and it was a live production, so they used a real horse. And during the dress rehearsal, that horse threw the lead actor, who thankfully escaped serious injury, but that was touch and go. Given the hazards of new theater and a new medium that is live, it was running about 8 to 10 minutes long when they were rehearsing it. Now, this was a big problem because before television, if you're doing a stage play and it ran 8 to 10 minutes long, it wasn't a big deal. The audience just stuck it out for another 8 to 10 minutes. And if it was a good show, they enjoyed it. They would do the curtain call, everyone would leave. But with television, there was something else that was scheduled to come on. You couldn't miss the end by 10 minutes. So they had to figure out what to cut. And Wasserman decides he's going to cut the Impossible Dream soliloquy. At which point, the lead actor, a guy named Lee Cobb, completely revolts. This is the guy who was thrown off the horse, by the way, and he comes storming up to the booth, which actors are definitely not supposed to do. And then Cobb essentially hardlines and says, you can do a lot of things. I can find other ways we can cut the script, but you're not taking out the Impossible Dream soliloquy. That was a good call by Lee Cobb, I would say. So the show airs. It has an audience of 20 million. Of course, at the time, there's no internet. So for immediate feedback, there were just landline telephones. And this is happening in television for the first time. So a lot of people who just watched the show would pick up the phone, tell the operator to connect them to the studio, which was how you made a phone call in 1959, and just say, hey, is Dale Wasserman there? Or I want to talk to the guy who did that Don Quixote production. And then they would chatter about everything from praise to criticism to script suggestions, which is sort of interesting. There are so many twists and turns that made it unlikely that the very first staging of the show would even happen. Had the horse injured the lead actor, he might not have been replaced, and then he would not have talked Wasserman out of cutting the Impossible Dream soliloquy, and the musical might never have come into being. But all those things fell into place. It totally worked. There was an audience of 20 million people. There was some feedback, and most of it was positive. And Wasserman is now a full-time professional writer. He's got a bunch of different projects going on, and he's now got to figure out, what do we do with this thing, The Man from La Mancha? Because if it had been a theatrical production, then it would have had a theatrical run. But what do you do with a one-off TV showing? So the next thing that has to happen is that this play will be made into a musical. And it's not especially likely that this is going to happen. Wasserman opens his book by saying this, quote, this was a production that nobody wanted booked into a theater that nobody else would have and ignored by everyone except for the public, end quote. And now, as they're trying to develop this musical, which nobody wants, they're using a composer, and they figure out halfway through the process that he could not play an instrument. It was a musical made by a composer who could not play an instrument, written by an author who had never gone to college, and you can tack that on to the end of Wasserman's quote that would then go on to become a production nobody wanted, booked in a theater nobody else would have, that was ignored by everyone except for the public. Those are a lot of unlikely things that all had to break exactly the right way for The Man from La Mancha to become a musical. The story itself is not an adaptation. Wasserman details that he was spending time trying to figure out how to make Don Quixote into a story that he could tell. How is he going to adapt that into a stage play or a screenplay or whatever it was they were doing, or a musical? And he finally just decided to give that up and decide that this should be a story about Cervantes. So the play, and now the musical, starts in prison, where the prisoners got together. They hold a mock trial, and Cervantes is accused of being a bad poet and whatnot. He pleads guilty, but then he asks if he can perform Don Quixote to the other prisoners. All of this narrative then becomes part of multiple identities. The character who is Cervantes is going to perform Don Quixote. It's a play about sanity and madness, and it's not been done before, and it's got a polyvocal nature. There are multiple voices, multiple perspectives, and multiple statements about reality. And as a sidebar, Philip K. Dick was a science fiction author. His house is actually 2 blocks from where I am currently living, and he was famous for the whole idea of asking the question of what reality is. He wrote a short story that was called Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? And that idea of his exploded in becoming the famous Harrison Ford movie Blade Runner, and what Philip K. Dick is now revered for is being one of the seminal people to think about this notion of what the difference is between reality and one's perception of reality. And indeed, those are all important themes, and you can find all of them in Don Quixote, both in the book and in the musical. As I mentioned, it is set in the Inquisition, which is weird because I mentioned before, Scott Miller, who's the creative director of a fairly important theater, has written about this extensively. And he always talks a lot about the Inquisition and whatnot as it pertains to the play. And the play is all like, here is what the Inquisition was like at that time in Spain. That's what you get if you read Scott Miller. And that's his background for helping us understand Don Quixote. And it is also a little unusual that Wasserman set the play in the Inquisition as if Miguel de Cervantes was being held for the Inquisition. But of course, Cervantes was never called before the Inquisition. The only reference I can find in my shoddy research that mentions Cervantes and the Inquisition was that during the time he'd been captured by the Ottomans, he was held in prison and he made several attempts to escape. And there's this guy named De Paz who had sold out one of their escape attempts. He was going to be a part of the jailbreak, but then he got cold feet. He told the captors and they essentially stopped the escape. But then all the prisoners got ransomed and were scheduled for release. So now De Paz is like, oh crap, I ratted these guys out. They're going to go free and they're going to come after me. So he posed as a member of the Inquisition and then attempted to hold a trial to make Cervantes accountable for all the misdeeds of De Paz. But there was this friar, in fact, the guy who had ransomed Cervantes, who called him out and was able to prove that he actually had no authority for the Inquisition or anything else. I went over this in episode 2, and if you want to hear the whole story, it's back there. But this is important here because that's the closest, from what I can tell, that Cervantes ever came to being held by the Inquisition, which makes it unusual that Scott Miller would spend so much time talking about it, and even a little weird that Wasserman would decide that needs to be the central frame for his story. There have been many, many attempts to put Don Quixote back into historical context, and it's just weird to me that Cervantes circled around to the Inquisition when I don't really think that was a big part of Cervantes' motivation. Be that as it may, that's where the musical is set. The big song is, of course, called The Impossible Dream, and the actual name of that track is The Quest. Wasserman includes the famous stanza, and I'm going to quote it here, to dream the impossible dream, to fight the unbeatable foe. This is man's privilege and the only life worth living. Wasserman says that as he was writing it, he put it in and then he kept taking it out and putting it back in, like he'd scribble it out and then he'd write it again. But he finally decided to include it. And based on his account of trying to take it out of the first stage production, that makes it seem like he was kind of waffling back and forth on that phrase and maybe even on the concept. But I do think it is now understood correctly as the main theme that's being put forward in the musical. And while I think that Wasserman is nobody's historical researcher, I do think he's definitely right about what it is in his musical that resonates with the audience. This is what Wasserman will write at the end of his book. And please note the baseball reference, quote, "The impossible dream is constantly applied to ventures that might be somewhat difficult, but are perfectly possible. A pennant for the Mets, for example. When I see these references, my impulse is to holler, pay attention, damn it. The operative word is not dream. The operative word is impossible," end quote. And then he goes on to the next paragraph to say, of course, nobody listens to me, but impossible is exactly what I meant. The dream to be valid must be impossible, not difficult, impossible, which implies an ideal that's never going to be attainable, but nevertheless stubbornly must be pursued. It's a striving for what can't be achieved, but is still worth the effort. For example, peace on earth, or a hope that we might mitigate the horrors paraded for us on every news hour of every day of every week, that we might reduce the tidal surge of wars, crimes, cruelties to humans and animals, and the orgies of atrocities that sicken the earth. These are impossible dreams. Still, chaotically, they must be dreamed. I think that's Wasserman's point. I took a little poetic license there, but that is what really strikes me about the musical and what it is trying to say. So the play is set with the Inquisition. It's about an insane human who's following these chivalrous ideals, and what Wasserman takes from all these impossible dreams, these noble actions that must be pursued, not because you can overcome impossible odds, but precisely because you can't. And what matters primarily is the motivation of the person pursuing them. Back in episode 1, we talk more about the text and why it's been interpreted in so many different ways. But I think what Wasserman has is definitely the modern interpretation. I don't know that Cervantes would have recognized that meaning in his book. Certainly, Cervantes' 17th century audiences would not have. There's a good argument that for all of its brilliance, the book succeeded primarily because it was funny, and the audiences at the time were definitely laughing at Don Quixote. They were not crying with him because of his impossible dream, but it's that new modern spin that Wasserman put in his musical that totally clicked and resonates for the modern audiences. So Wasserman now has his idea. He knows what his musical is about, and it's going to be performed. And the musical is first performed in Connecticut. It had 2 runs of a couple of weeks each. They tinkered with it in between to get to the final version. And that happened when the producer, who, according to Wasserman's account, they had actually never met, showed up to one of the performances and announced, "Hey, I'm taking the show to New York." So now they are moving the production from Connecticut to New York, but it's not going to Broadway. It's going to this place, the Anta Theater. That's ANTA, all caps, in New York. It's now 1965. The play is going to be in Greenwich Village, and Greenwich Village is strongly associated for what we think with about the 1960s experimentation now and all its manifestations. There's a little bit of lechery. There's definitely an openness to new ideas and new things. And that really helps because the Anta Theater is no great facility. It had no orchestra pit, so they had to split the musicians and put them off to the side and in the wings. So there were some musicians on the left-hand side, some musicians on the right-hand side in the wings. This had the effect of creating a stereo sound, though, which some of the critics actually liked. It was an accident, but it was one of those things that they had to deal with in the suboptimal space that worked. The actors had no means of crossing the stage out of view. So if the actor exits stage left, they had no way of ever coming back again on stage right. To counter this, they decided they were going to dig a tunnel under the theater, quote, only to find ourselves encountering uncoffined skeletons wrapped in moldering cerements, unquote. Okay, let me just say, Wasserman, this dude can write. Let's reflect on that sentence. Only to find ourselves encountering an uncoffined skeleton wrapped in moldering cerements. What a way with words. If that's what you get out of a year of high school, we should all be so lucky. And then he goes on to say, quote, authorities were called in. They had ascertained that we had, in fact, collided with a potter's field dating from the plague of 1798, end quote. And that brings us to one of the strange coincidences. Just like Don Quixote, the novel, the Man from La Mancha, the musical, was born on the ashes of the plague. As Cervantes was writing his novel, he was doing it in cities that had been ravaged by plagues, where scores of dead bodies were disposed of in open potter fields. And how ironic that when the musical would be first performed in New York City, it too would sit on the remains of a plague field. After that, there were other weird portents. At the very first dress rehearsal, the power went out, and it stayed out for 16 hours. In fact, this was the power outage that knocked out not just New York, but the entire eastern seaboard. So with no dress rehearsal at all, the preview performance opened up, and there were only about 50 people there. It ran for a bunch of preview performances before they ever tried it for real. And it's just not an auspicious beginning that at the last dress rehearsal, when you're trying to iron out the final details of your show, if you find plague bodies underneath your theater and the power goes out, maybe it's a sign that there's some evil spirit attempting to stop your production from succeeding. I don't know. In the face of all these ill winds, the production went forward. So they eventually get past their preview performances. They have their opening night. They're all holed up in a bar to watch their reviews come in. And the very first one is on NBC. It's a televised review by a guy named Edward Newman. According to Wasserman, here's what he had to say, quote, Newman reviewed the leading lady's bust, which he found admirable. As for the show, he simply dismissed it, suggesting, quote, don't bother. After Saturday, it won't be there, end quote. So after hearing that, and according to Wasserman's account, he was so depressed he went off to go drink himself unconscious in an alley somewhere, but one of his friends convinced him to stay at the celebration. The other reviews came in, and almost all of them were enormously positive, which you might expect in hindsight, knowing how successful this became. And so the run at the Anta Theater was incredibly successful. It was doing well enough that 3 years later, it got moved to Broadway. So in 1968, it hits the Broadway main drag. It launched, and then it really took off. It had 2,328 performances. It was then revived a year after it closed. It had a total of 4 revivals. And this is the most delicious of all of them. There was a revival where the 2 leads were Raul Julia and Sheena Easton. All right, now, Raul Julia is probably an accomplished guy that has a bunch of very impressive accomplishments that make an impressive theater resume. But to be frank, in my pedestrian understanding of the world, I only knew him as the guy who played Daddy Munster in the Addams Family movie franchise. And the female lead, Sheena Easton, she's the one who sang For Your Eyes Only from the James Bond film. But her big hit was Morning Train. It was like, here's the lyrics. My baby takes the morning train. He works from 9 to 5 and then he takes another home again. Lyrical genius. And she also performed the duet We've Got Tonight with Kenny Rogers. Oh my God. So say you're 58 years old, as Dale Wasserman was when he wrote The Man from La Mancha, and as Miguel de Cervantes was when he wrote Don Quixote, and as I am when I am doing this podcast. So if you're 58 in 2024 and your children look at you and say, what was it like in the 1980s? Just Google Sheena Easton, put that search term in YouTube and watch the videos, and you will have the archetypical examples of what the 1980s were like. Anyway, according to Wasserman, it was just terrible. Julia, according to him, can't sing. That's a problem in a musical. And Sheena Easton kept getting sick, so the production did not go very well. Sad. We can only guess how history would have been different had Sheena Easton been cast instead with Kenny Rogers or Raul Julia paired with Angelica Houston. We'll never know. Anyway, that version of the show was not its most successful, but the original opening thing was a huge hit with more than 2,000 shows. So it's gone from Connecticut to off-Broadway to the middle of Broadway. It starts in 1968. It has a bunch of revivals. It wins 5 Tonys in 2015. And ironically, the Shakespeare Theater Company performed it. If you listen to episode 2, you know that there are many who see a connection between Shakespeare and Cervantes, who are reputed to have died on the same day. That is, Shakespeare and Cervantes died on the same day. Eerie connection, right? They actually didn't because they were using a different calendar, but they did definitely die within a week of each other. So there's some strange connection between those two, which makes it a little more ironic that the Shakespeare Theater Company would perform an adaptation of Cervantes' great work. History seems to want those two guys to constantly dance next to each other, but not with each other. Those Broadway renditions are only one of the steady increase in the number of productions that the show would have and the number of languages that it's been performed in. Wasserman says that it may be the most successful musical of all time if success is measured in the number of places it's been played. It definitely had a long and very successful run in Japan. Wasserman also has a very bitter description of how it played out in France. And Wasserman's conclusion is that there are now 300 to 400 productions of it every year. That's quite a bit. And that Broadway run was incredible. It's up there with the longest Broadway runs of all time. The success, though, was crushing on Wasserman personally. It was very demanding of his time. I guess if you have a Broadway hit, a lot of people want to talk to you to get free tickets, to talk to you about movie rights and whatnot. And he was still trying to juggle his other projects, which he kept working on. He had what others might call a nervous breakdown, and what he describes in the book as an episode of full paralysis, where he goes to bed one night and actually cannot get out of bed the next day. And this, of course, fulfills the second part of Olga's prophecy, that it would come to overwhelm his life and that his future would not go well. Olga is now batting 1,000, and the summary at this point is that the musical has been a success on a global scale and has overwhelmed Wasserman's life as it might overwhelm anybody's, and exactly as Olga predicted, both things would happen. Which leads us to the last question that I'll be taking on in this episode, and that is why? Why did this musical work, and what lesson can we draw from it? I've used the phrase shoddy academic research to describe what I'm doing in this podcast, but maybe shoddy isn't exactly the right word. Should I say slapdash or cattywampus? Maybe I'll use scattershot, although I like the other 2 words better. Yes, this is a scattershot academic research podcast. What I'm going to be doing here is no attempt to be exhaustive and cover everything that's ever been written, but I do want to find the parts of any musical that are interesting to me and see where that takes us. Find whatever is mysterious and fun and pursue that. But in the end, what I want to see and what I want to ask and what I want to know is there something about this production that will give us a lesson about life, theater, and everything? Or as Dirk gently insists, it is all connected. Can we figure out what those connections are? There is almost a physical manifestation, like a mist you can feel about the mystery surrounding this production. The first thing, and Wasserman himself is very clear about this, is that facts can't explain what happened with this musical. I'm going to quote from his book for a little bit. Life magazine had called The Man from La Mancha a, quote, metaphysical smasheroo. And commenting on that, Wasserman has written this, quote, facts in their guise as statistics might explain the smasheroo part of the equation, but they are surely impotent in dealing with the metaphysical aspect, which I believe contains the secret. End quote. God, that guy can write. But just think of all the impossible things that had to happen for this musical to work in the first place. It had to be successful enough in its first stage play on television with a live horse actor that it was worth thinking about making into a musical. It had to get from Connecticut to New York. It had to be performed on a plague burial ground, and it had to have enough of a positive reaction that it would get from that burial ground through the power outages and finally get onto Broadway. And then it had to stick once it got there. And then it had to spread beyond Broadway to every major stage on the globe, including the Shakespeare Company in England, a production in Spain, successful productions in Japan, the productions that Wasserman hated in France, and a bunch of other smaller renditions from Indonesia to Long Beach. And all of this was accurately predicted by the psychic in the Palm Springs restaurant. Weird. I agree with Dan Wasserman that larger forces are at play. Maybe not exactly the supernatural forces that I wish were there, but definitely something. Wasserman himself means two things about the success and about that metaphysical nature. What is it about the metaphysics of this story that have made it resonate so powerfully for so many audiences? Here's the first explanation, and this is from Wasserman, and he says it is because it is accessible. Listen to this. This is a quote from page 193. Quote, I believe that what keeps the Man of La Mancha alive is not only its philosophy, but its accessibility. It can be performed in a myriad of ways, in all sorts of spaces, and at many levels of professionalism. It's almost immune to indifferent actors. It works even in the hands of amateurs and artsy directors. I've seen it performed in a tent adjacent to a thundering freeway, on a stage bare of all scenery but projection screens, in the midst of a war with the interruptions of exploding grenades in almost every conceivable environment. In California, it's being played to the musical accompaniment, not of an orchestra, but of a single guitar in the hands of a lone musician who wanders a bare stage. As I write, the production is now in its 20th week of an open-ended run. So not an impossible musical after all, merely improbable. End quote. Okay, I got you, Dan, but I will humbly posit that it's even more than that. Your explanation does kind of mean that it's accessible, but what you're saying there isn't so much that people can relate to it, but that there is something transcendent enough about the story that it's not really the production value of The Man of La Mancha which grips the audience. I think maybe you had a better explanation at the beginning of the book than at the end of it. And here's what Wasserman has to say on page 9. Quote, I believed in the play. It was written from the gut. Initially, I didn't believe it. That is, initially, I had challenged myself to solve a problem of adaptation, which a legion of writers had failed, on the unlikely assumption that I might succeed somewhere en route. That motive changed. What replaced it was a quest burning no less hotly than the dawn's, a quest to discover personal values through a defined and clearly articulated credo. Whatever motive commenced the process, quite another completed it. There is more to that metaphysical side. It was evidenced in the flood of mail I began receiving at the opening of the show, and that, though diminished, continues to this very day. The wild variety of interpretations of a text I had thought to be simplistically clear astonished me. There were many who identified Quixote as Jesus Christ, which I found puzzling, since neither I nor my play have any interest in religion whatsoever. Others found various spiritual interpretations. Most of them represented not interpretations of the play so much as verification of the letter writer's own beliefs. But there was one theme that coursed through almost all of the communications. In one way or another, they say the play changed my life. But this I understood. Not so much that the play had actually changed anyone's life, but that it had reawakened the idea of adolescence, ideals that had died of the attrition of living. It was less change than restoration. End quote. For the final time, I will say, man, that guy can write. I do think that between both of Wasserman's explanations, this is what comes out. The final lesson is that if you can find a core truth so deep and so powerful, it can literally alter reality for you. It can survive all attempts to kill it no matter what. Even if Lope de Vega hated Don Quixote at the time that Cervantes wrote it, there was something in there that was going to survive. And no matter how many times it would be interpreted, reinterpreted, misinterpreted, misunderstood, there's a core truth. It's deep enough and it's powerful enough to persist. It was, as Wasserman was saying, a credo that could be articulated, that you could take your individual values and explain what they were. In Wasserman's telling, it's almost the story of Job, where you have to pursue the impossible dream because it's the right thing to pursue and not because you think it's going to work. And as I thought about it, putting it together for this episode, that rings true to me in at least three different ways. I earlier mentioned Philip K. Dick. He was one of the greatest science fiction authors of all time. And his work that made a big hit in Hollywood was actually not his first or maybe even his best. His first work was a book in 1960 that was called The Man in the High Castle, which has incidentally also been remade into a Netflix series. And the idea behind that was that he retold a narrative of North America based on the assumption that the Axis had won World War II, that America had lost. So as the narrative starts, the Japanese are occupying California, and they're, of course, now acting as the oppressors. And that's something for 1960, because in his story, all the white people are getting treated by Asian and black people in the same way that white people were in reality treating black people and Asian people. But in the narrative, what changes everything is that the lead character comes across an item that contains what he calls wu. And I believe that's a Chinese word that means a kernel of truth. And in the story, it's a little physical artifact the character can hold. And when he holds on to this artifact of truth, the false reality of the Axis victory melts away, and the true reality of the Allied victory comes through literally. The book is about a kernel of truth that can uncover and rewrite a reality and change the world for the better. That is such a poignant fit with Don Quixote, a human who sees the world in the wrong way, but the only way to survive in a world as unfair and unpleasant as the one that we are in is to cling to that kernel of truth and beauty with the belief that you can change and unravel the reality and make you see it in a completely different way, even if it leads to your own tragic end. If you've ever read Pedagogy of the Oppressed by Paulo Freire, all of this will seem very familiar to you. And then the second thing is, I believe in this kernel of truth phenomena because I have seen it happen. I've been a high school and college debate coach for the majority of my life. And if you're unfamiliar with what that scene is like, just think about college football. It is that competitive, just use words instead of the physical collisions. And that's what it's like. And now imagine that you're Appalachian State and you're competing against Ohio State and Michigan. You're going into that game. What makes you think you can win it? They have every advantage. They've got recruiters you don't have. They have coaching you don't have. They've got facilities and practice areas that you don't have. They've got scouting that you don't have. They've got all of the 4-star recruits, and you don't have any of that. What makes you think you can win? And the exact same thing happens at the high school and college debate level. You are going into a debate against Northwestern or Harvard or Texas or USC or Berkeley, and they all have better test scores than you did coming out of high school, or they wouldn't be there. They were recruited, and most of them are getting scholarships, and you're freaking Cal State Fullerton. What makes you think that you can go in there and take on these teams that have every advantage? They have their tuition paid, they have tutors, they have personalized coaches, and they have faculty who have no other job other than to help your opponent get good on debate. And you're competing at Cal State Fullerton where your coach is teaching 4 other classes. What makes you think you can win? What makes it work is the belief that if you have one argument that was good enough, one idea that was true enough, you can unravel all of those disadvantages, that you could speak that truth and it would change everything about the debate you were in and all the technical skills, all the mounds of evidence that the other team has and you don't. You could defeat all of that if you just had that kernel of truth. And I watched my students do that. It was like living a Hollywood movie every day. The great privilege of my life was that I got to be part of it. There were certainly other places than Cal State Fullerton where things like that happen, but that was what I got to see and what I got to watch my students do it. That kernel of truth idea, I believe in because I have seen it happen. And I guess part of the reason that I think Wasserman is correct about his interpretation of his play and why it works is that it's about finding a credo that articulates your values and sticking with it. That's a powerful, resonant, transcendent message. I've seen it happening with some of the most inspiring students that I've ever had a chance to work with. And now that third thing I want to talk about, another and especially poignant example, and one that Wasserman himself notes, it's like the Mets winning the pennant. Now, Wasserman is writing his book in 2003, so he could have been talking about the 2000 New York Met trip to the World Series, but I don't really think he was doing that. And he could have been talking about 1986, the year when the Mets actually won the World Series. But I think he's talking about 1969, the year of the Miracle Mets, when they went from the worst team in baseball, in fact, the worst team in modern history, until the White Sox did an epic faceplant in 2024. But they were definitely the worst team in baseball in the modern era between 1962 to the middle part of 1969, where they were slogging through what looked like another terrible season. They were 10 games out just before the All-Star break, and then impossibly, unbelievably came through not only to topple the Chicago Cubs, but to win the World Series. And they're not the only sports team that has done something impossible. The Appalachian State team did beat the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Michigan, in front of 110,000 fans. Appalachian State comes from Boone, North Carolina, which has an entire population of about 19,000 people. Imagine coming from that town to a place where 110,000 Michiganders are all yelling terrible things at you to discourage you to the maximum extent that they can do so from playing well on the field. But none of it mattered. Appalachian State found something to believe in, and they won the game. How does that happen? What worked for the 1969 Mets? I think for the sports teams, you can tell when there's a woo, there's a kernel of truth. There's something magic that the team taps into. For the 1969 Mets, it was Tug McGraw saying, "You gotta believe." For the Anaheim Angels, it was the Rally Monkey, or the 1979 Pittsburgh Pirates, who adopted the song "We Are Family" as their theme song, or Tommy Trumpet coming out and performing before the closer came on, as he did for the 2023 Mets. Or it could even be like the 1986 Chicago Bears doing the Super Bowl shuffle, or the Icky Shuffle, or the Dirty Bird, whatever it is. In the world of sports, if you find a thing, be it a dance or a song or a motto, if you can find the thing that everyone rallies around, just feel it. It just resonates. It feels good. That's what the Mets had in 1969. That's what the Bears had in 1986. And that is what the Man from La Mancha has. There's a kernel of truth in there. There's an element of woo, and it brings it all together to make it work. So here is my take-home point. A Dirk Gently moment is when we discover what can make a narrative, what can make a story, what can make a musical work, and it's always a bunch of things coming together at once. And what Wasserman was talking about, something that can overcome indifferent actors or artsy directors or a myriad of other problems, are that in that show, there's a kernel of truth. There's something so powerful that it can resonate for an audience. If you can find that "you gotta believe" thing, if you can find that song like "We Are Family" that unites people behind you, then it is possible to do completely unexpected things and make reality transform from an impossible monolith that you can't overcome to a series of windmills that you might be able to defeat with your sword if only you were a brave enough knight. That'll do it for The Man from La Mancha and for Don Quixote. It is one of the greatest novels of all time, written by a guy who had an incredible life, adapted into one of the most successful musicals ever. And so as you set forth in your life today and the challenges you face and your choices, just ask yourself, what would Sheena Easton do? And then maybe supplement that with what would Miguel de Cervantes do? In our next episode, we will switch from The Man from La Mancha to The Phantom of the Opera. What inspired that book? Were there real events? When an intrepid researcher, not me, scoured the French National Archives and came across what might have been the original manuscript for the book, what did that manuscript reveal? Was there really a chandelier accident in the Paris Opera House? Does the Opera House really sit on a catacombs that contain skeletons? We'll find out together in the next episode of Theater, History, and Mysteries.